Last week, I set out on a long and intense road trip. The plan was simple: drive from New York to California in 5 or 6 days. I've made this trip often, but this time, the schedule was tight. I was prepared to spend at least 9 hours a day behind the wheel. Exhausting, sure, but I'd done it before at least twice. This time, I planned everything down to the last detail: fuel stops, hotels for rest. But as I learned the hard way, plans rarely survive reality. The rental car was brand new. The fresh upholstery smell mingled with the aroma of the coffee I picked up from a drive-thru. Despite the exhaustion I was bracing for, the thrill of driving across American roads, especially at night, gave me a strange kind of excitement. The first 4 days of the trip went smoothly. I love our wide, almost empty highways. On top of that, I was listening to a new audiobook from my recent Audible subscription. Everything felt perfect, and I kept telling myself this year was going to be different. It had started off on the right foot, and everything would go exactly as planned. But that illusion shattered halfway through day 5. That's when things started to change. Around 4 p.m., my GPS suggested a detour to avoid traffic caused by a major accident. The road had been closed. The last time something like this happened to me was because some Hollywood celebrity got into a wreck. They didn't close the road because it was all that serious. The person walked away fine, but because of the media circus. I was slightly annoyed about the reroute, but at least I was still driving instead of stuck in a never-ending line of cars. If there's one thing I've always hated, it's traffic. The new route took me down a secondary road, flanked by dense trees. The scenery, though beautiful, didn't outweigh my growing discomfort. The road was deserted, and I started feeling increasingly isolated. Where were the other drivers also taking this detour? A short while later, I passed a rundown gas station. The neon sign was partially burnt out. The few cars in the lot looked abandoned, and one even had its door hanging open. Something felt off, and it made me uneasy, so I ignored it and kept driving with half a tank of gas. Sooner or later, I figured, there'd be another place to fill up. As the sun dipped lower, the weight of isolation grew heavier. By about 7 p.m., my GPS lost signal, leaving me driving nearly blind in the dark with no clear destination. The only good thing was that the road was 99% straight. Since taking the detour, I'd only made 2 turns. I told myself I just needed to keep going straight. Then, around 10 p.m., I spotted a glimmer of light in the distance and sped toward it, hopeful. It turned out to be a convenience store attached to an old gas station, like something frozen in time. The place looked dead, just like the other station, but I needed gas, so I had no choice but to stop. As I stepped out of the car, the air felt heavy and damp. The pump was in terrible shape, and a rusted sign informed me that payment had to be made inside the store. I pushed open the glass door, which creaked ominously. Inside, the atmosphere was oppressive. Shelves were messy, products looked decades old, and a flickering fluorescent light added to the unsettling vibe. Behind the counter, a middle-aged man stood up with a blank expression. I explained I needed gas. He pointed to the prices and asked for prepayment. His gaze was completely lifeless, like someone who'd lost all interest in living. I pulled out my wallet, and as I handed him the bills, I noticed him hesitate. He gave me an uncomfortable look, and just as I was about to ask what was wrong, he said he needed to get change. It struck me as odd since the cash register was open right in front of me, and there were bills inside. But it was his store, his rules, so I didn't comment. He disappeared through a door in the back and was gone for only a moment. I thought I heard a voice. When he returned, he had the change, but something about him had shifted. Now, he seemed like a different person, more engaged, with a strange spark in his eyes. The change in behavior felt bizarre. He asked if I was from around there, if I was traveling with family or alone. His tone was friendly but clearly forced. Then, he glanced over my shoulder toward where my car was parked. Instinctively, I looked too. but it was pitch dark outside, and I couldn't see much. When I looked back at him, his demeanor had reverted to its earlier indifference. He didn't care about me anymore, and even seemed to look at me with disdain. I figured he was just off his rocker and left quickly without another word. As I filled up the tank, I couldn't stop glancing back at the store. The more I thought about the man's behavior, the more unsettling it felt. What had he done behind that door? Something didn't add up. As soon as I was done, I got in the car and took off as fast as I could. It was full-on nighttime now, and the darkness seemed to swallow everything around me. I decided I wouldn't feel safe until I'd put some distance between me and that man. Once inside the car, I felt a little more secure, but at the same time, it was clear nothing was going as planned. My phone had been charging for ages, but it was still dead. The battery was completely shot. If I needed to make a call, I was out of luck. The GPS was still down, only picking up a weak signal every now and then. And far ahead, there wasn't a single light in sight. I didn't think I'd ever been in such a remote part of California. About 20 minutes later, I heard a loud pop, and the car immediately started pulling to the right. I knew the tire had blown. I pulled over to the shoulder, heart racing. That's when everything clicked. The man's behavior, his trip to the back, the way he kept looking toward my car. Someone had sabotaged it. I was sure of it. I'm not the kind of guy who just sits around waiting to get attacked. Still scared but determined, I grabbed the knife I kept in the trunk, slung my backpack over my shoulder, and left the car. Then, I ran straight into the woods lining the road. Maybe I was overreacting, but my gut instinct had never failed me before. I wasn't about to stay near the car like a sitting duck, waiting for the guy to show up. I found a hiding spot among the trees, dark and far enough from the road that I felt invisible. But I had a clear view of the road. Barely 5 minutes later, a car approached, slowed down near mine, and stopped just ahead. 2 men got out. One of them was the guy from the store. They were both holding metal pipes. I had already suspected something like this, but seeing it confirmed sent a chill through me. They smashed my car window and rummaged through the inside. The way they moved, full of anger, made it clear they were after more than just a robbery. Then, they started looking around, as if searching for me. The fear of being found was paralyzing, but I stayed completely still. I gripped my knife tightly, knowing how to use it and fully prepared to do so if necessary. The feel of the handle in my hand gave me a strange sense of calm. Eventually, they gave up and returned to their car. But something told me not to move just yet. And I was right. A few minutes later, their car came back. They were searching for me, driving up and down the road. They knew I couldn't have gotten far on foot. After about 20 minutes of not seeing their car, I decided to start walking through the forest. With every step, the feeling of being followed grew stronger. I was exhausted, and the adrenaline that had kept me going earlier was starting to fade. The cold began creeping in, making things even worse. Around 5 a.m., I heard and then saw headlights in the distance. I threw myself onto the road, ready to face whoever was in the car. I couldn't keep wandering in the cold, so I decided to take my chances. If it was those guys, they'd have to deal with me and my knife. Luckily, it was a kind couple. Despite my dirty and terrified state, they stopped to help. 2 hours later, I was sitting in a police station in Julian, California, recounting everything that had happened. The cops are now working on following up with my descriptions and other details. I won't rest until those men are behind bars. Hey, Horror Spectator here. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on post notifications so you're always in the loop when new videos drop. We post 2 videos every week. If you're really into this content, consider sharing it with your friends. It really helps us grow this community. Now, let's move on to the second story. Driving through California at night had always been an escape for me. The quiet roads, the hum of the tires on the pavement, the cool breeze sneaking in through a cracked window, it all felt meditative. But there's something about isolation that twists the familiar into the sinister when you least expect it. It was 9 p.m. when I left San Francisco, my car packed for a long drive to Mount Shasta. The plan was to get out of the city late at night, avoid the chaos of daytime traffic, and make it to my lodging near the mountains by early morning. It wasn't my first overnight drive through California, and though I enjoyed the quiet roads, the isolation sometimes got to me. Still, there was a certain thrill about driving into the darkness with nothing but the glow of my headlights cutting through the night. The first hours were smooth. Interstate 5 was practically empty, and I cruised along at a steady pace, sipping coffee from a thermos. As the city lights faded, the landscape opened into endless stretches of farmland and sparse towns. I felt a calm sense of control, a stark contrast to what was about to unfold. Around 3 a.m., I noticed my fuel gauge dipping lower than expected. I should have filled up in Sacramento, but I was listening to a new audiobook, and it completely distracted me. It wasn't until nearly 4 a.m. that I realized I was dangerously close to empty. The GPS directed me to a gas station off the highway. Turning onto a secondary road, I was struck by how desolate it felt. The trees seemed to close in around the pavement, and the only sounds were the hum of my tires and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. After about 15 minutes, I saw a dimly lit sign ahead. The station was immaculate. Bright, sterile lights illuminated every corner of the lot. The pumps gleamed as if freshly polished, and the pristine white tiles around the storefront sparkled under the fluorescence. It felt less like a gas station and more like the waiting room of a new hospital, eerily devoid of personality or wear. I pulled up to one of the pumps, noticing the complete absence of other vehicles. It was unnervingly quiet, with no sound other than the low hum of the overhead lights and the faint rustle of a breeze in the nearby trees. Despite its perfection, the place felt wrong. Too clean, too artificial, like a set constructed for a purpose I couldn't yet grasp. Inside the station, the shelves were stocked neatly with identical rows of snacks, drinks, and supplies, each aligned with uncanny precision. The cashier, a young woman with a blank expression and a uniform as spotless as the store, didn't look up as I entered. Her face was almost doll-like, smooth skin, neutral features, and eyes that barely blinked. I paid for $40 worth of gas and stepped outside to pump. The air was crisp and still. As I worked, the sensation of being watched grew stronger, prickling the back of my neck. My eyes darted to the windows of the station, expecting to see the cashier staring at me, but she remained still, almost motionless behind the counter. It was probably just how isolated the place felt and the fact that it was just the two of us. Even the woman seemed a bit out of place, working like that all alone, completely cut off. She probably had some kind of defense I hadn't noticed in case someone showed up with less than good intentions. I was thinking about this when I heard it. A low rumble in the distance. Headlights appeared down the empty road, approaching slowly, their beams cutting through the darkness. A large black SUV pulled into the lot, its windows heavily tinted. It parked at the pump farthest from mine, and the engine shut off, leaving the area plunged into an eerie silence once more. No one got out. I glanced over, hoping to catch some movement or glimpse a figure. But the vehicle remained still, its dark presence looming. My gut tightened with unease. Something wasn't right. I tried to focus on the task at hand, willing myself to ignore the SUV, but my hands fumbled as I replaced the gas nozzle. The faint sound of a car door opening made me freeze, and slowly, I turned my head. A man had stepped out. He was tall and dressed in dark clothing, his face partially obscured by a hood. He didn't acknowledge me, instead moving around to the passenger side of the SUV. A second figure emerged, shorter and wearing a similar dark ensemble. Neither spoke. They stood there for a moment, their heads tilting slightly, as if scanning the area. My heart pounded as I got into my car, locking the doors immediately. The moment I saw them standing in the empty lot, I knew they weren't there by chance. The way they moved, purposeful, coordinated, made it clear they had come for something, or someone. My gut churned as my thoughts shifted to the cashier. She was the only other person out here, and I couldn't leave her alone with them. The men walked toward the station, their movements deliberate. My car was still running, but I couldn't leave. Not yet. I stayed low, trying to avoid drawing attention, as they pushed the glass door open and stepped inside. Even from the car, I could hear their voices, sharp and demanding, their tone a mockery of friendliness. They called the woman's name, the syllables bouncing off the sterile walls of the gas station. I leaned forward to get a better look, dread tightening in my chest. She wasn't there. The stool behind the counter was empty. And then I saw her. Just a fleeting glimpse of her silhouette slipping out the side door. She was running. Without thinking, I slammed the gear shift into drive and gunned it toward the rear of the building. I pulled up beside her. For a moment, she froze, her eyes flicking between me and the station behind her, as if weighing her options. Then, without another second's hesitation, she climbed into the car and slammed the door shut. I pressed the gas pedal hard, the tires kicking up gravel as we sped back toward the road. The forest loomed ahead, dark and indifferent, as we raced away from the station. For a fleeting moment, I thought we'd escaped. But then, the glow of headlights appeared in the rearview mirror, growing brighter, closer. They were coming for her. Their SUV was faster, more powerful. It gained on us easily, its engine roaring like a predator closing in on its prey. I pushed my car to its limits, the tires screeching around curves as we wound through the desolate road. But I wasn't familiar with the terrain, and the SUV's driver knew it better. The woman beside me was already on her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed the police. A sharp turn brought us onto a narrower stretch of road, the trees on either side pressing in like silent witnesses. I glanced in the mirror and caught a glimpse of one of the men leaning out the truck's passenger window, his arm extended. Something glinted in the faint moonlight, a gun. The woman grabbed the seat to steady herself, and I could hear her speaking into the phone, her voice a bit frantic but controlled. She was giving the police our exact location and letting them know that the men were armed. Fortunately, she knew the road well, and as she spoke, she explained to me that the police had directed us to head in a specific direction. About 10 minutes ahead, there was a convenience store, just 7 minutes from the nearest police station. It gave them more than enough time to set up an operation to trap the men. The SUV's headlights loomed closer, bathing the interior of my car in a blinding glare. They were practically on top of us now, their engine growling louder with every passing second. I could hear the thud of metal as the truck clipped my bumper, sending a jolt through the frame of the car. The road stretched endlessly ahead, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the darkness. I didn't dare take my eyes off it, but I could feel the tension radiating from the woman beside me. Another jolt, harder this time, sent the car skidding briefly before I regained control. The SUV's driver was toying with us, nudging closer and closer, testing how much we could take. And then, up ahead, a faint glow. Lights. The store came into view, its neon sign flickering faintly against the black sky. Relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. The truck wasn't slowing down. Were they stupid? As we neared the station, a pair of headlights flickered on from the lot, brighter than the truck's and accompanied by the unmistakable silhouette of a police cruiser. The SUV's driver had seen it too because he slammed on the brakes. The screech of tires echoed through the night as the SUV swerved violently. But another cruiser appeared behind us from the middle of the trees, boxing them in. I pulled into the lot, my chest heaving as the tension finally broke. The woman beside me sagged in her seat, the phone still clutched in her hand. The officers moved quickly, their voices sharp and commanding as they approached the SUV. I didn't watch the arrests unfold. I couldn't. My hands were trembling too much. By the time it was over, the men were in handcuffs, their SUV impounded, and the station was quiet again. The woman thanked the officers before turning to me. Her expression was unreadable, a mix of gratitude and exhaustion. Without a word, she nodded, then walked toward one of the cruisers to give her statement. As I sat there in the car, staring at the now empty road, I couldn't help but think about how close we had come to something far worse. The wilderness had always seemed like a place of freedom and solitude, but tonight it had revealed its darker side. It was a typical winter night in California. The sky was pitch black and the rain was coming down hard, tapping against the windows of my car. It was well past midnight when I finally shut the office door behind me. After a long, exhausting day, all I wanted was to get home, take a hot shower, and crawl into bed. The problem was that I still had a 90-minute drive ahead of me, and I knew the road would feel even longer, especially this time of year when darkness took over the landscape so early. My route always took me down a back road, one that cut through fields and wound right alongside the mountains. A lot of people avoid that road, especially at night, not only because it's poorly lit, but because there are stories of strange disappearances and unexplainable encounters. Apparently, for many years, that area had been a site of violent confrontations, so a lot of people just stayed clear of it. I never bought into those stories. I'd lived around there for years, and nothing out of the ordinary had ever happened to me. But that night was about to show me just how wrong I was. The wind was blowing hard. I could feel it in the car, and the sound of the rain slamming against the windows gave me a weird, uneasy feeling. The only thing that made me feel remotely comfortable was the sound of my car's engine, a constant, familiar hum as my attention stayed fixed on the road ahead. Suddenly, something caught my eye. In the middle of the darkness, I spotted a figure standing at the edge of the road. At first, I thought it was just the rain playing tricks on my vision. But as I got closer, the silhouette became clearer. It was definitely a person. They didn't seem to be doing anything but waiting, maybe for a ride. I never picked anyone up on that road. Not because I was especially distrustful, but because, based on the stories I'd heard about encounters like that, most of them didn't end well. Still, that night, something in me seemed to have a strange kind of logic, a gut feeling telling me I should stop. It was dark, it was cold, and it was pouring rain. This guy must have been soaking wet. I felt sorry for him. He raised his hand in a clear gesture, and, reluctantly, I hit the brakes. The rain was coming down in sheets now, and I watched him hurry toward the car, walking fast. I rolled down the window to get a better look and talk to him. He told me he just needed a ride to the next town over. His eyes were hard to make out because of the darkness, but the shape of his face, though partially covered by rain, looked tired. He was probably in his 30s, maybe around my age. His hair was dark, and his clothes were simple. He had a bit of a Texas accent, but I couldn't pinpoint it exactly. I gestured for him to get in, and he immediately did, muttering his thanks. The sound of the door closing echoed in the car, and the rain kept hammering down as he settled into the passenger seat. There was something odd about the way he sat, but I couldn't quite place it. Maybe it was just the discomfort creeping in, having a stranger sitting next to me. I tried to tell myself it was fine. If I made small talk, we'd get there quickly. Then he'd go on his way, and I'd go on mine, and we wouldn't have to speak again. The car slid down the wet road, water streaming down the sides of the windows. I tried to stay focused and keep the conversation going, but the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. The guy next to me didn't say much, but when he did speak, he'd look straight at me in a way that made me uncomfortable. In one of those moments when I knew he was staring right at me, I glanced away from the road for a second and looked at him. It wasn't obvious, but there was something off about his expression. His mouth was slightly open, as if he was about to say something, but then he didn't. His hands were spread out, one over the other, almost like he was trying to hold himself back. Then, out of nowhere, he stopped staring at me and pulled out his phone. He seemed to be texting furiously, and I tried to sneak a glance, but he leaned to the side as if he didn't want me to see. By this point, I was genuinely starting to feel uneasy. My instincts were telling me something was off about this guy, but there wasn't much I could do. I wasn't about to stop the car and leave him there, especially if he turned on me. I just had to hold on a little longer, and it would all be over. Suddenly, while I was still processing who this guy was, he apologized and told me he wasn't going to the next town after all. About 5 minutes ahead, there was an intersection, and he asked if I could turn right instead of going straight. He saw my hesitation and told me the place he was headed to was only about 2 minutes past the turn. The detour would add no more than 5 minutes to my trip. It sounded really weird to me, but the guy was so insistent that I finally said, okay, just to get it over with. I accelerated the car, faster than I would have liked for a rainy night. I took the right turn at the intersection like he said, and kept going until he told me we were almost there. That's when I saw the house appear, all the lights off. I started to slow down and pulled up right next to the house. The guy started thanking me, and I, already irritated, told him it was no problem and asked him to get out. Without explanation, I turned my head slightly to my left, and that's when I saw it. Something moving on the side of the road, near the trees. The guy had the door open but was still sitting in the car, stalling. That's when it hit me. I used all my arm strength and threw the guy out of the car. He was caught off guard and couldn't even fight back. I watched him fall flat on the ground, and without bothering to close the door, I sped off. The moment I looked back in the rearview mirror, I saw 5 guys coming from the side of the road. I was about to be robbed, or worse. I stopped the car about 5 minutes down the road to close the door and keep going. That night, after I finally got home and calmed down, I truly reflected on what had happened. If I hadn't reacted so quickly, if I hadn't had that impulse to look left, I could still be out there on that road. Who knows what could have happened?